All right, well, welcome back to Bantha Fodder. I'm Jake Tender, and I'm joined by my co-host, Mike Comite.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, Mike, how's it going?
I'm good. I'm checking in from Astoria, Queens this episode as opposed to my normal Brooklyn location.
And why are you there?
Had a fun day on Fire Island with my girlfriend, and we wanted to have dinner, but my duty to this podcast is just so intense that I couldn't not record the podcast.
I appreciate your dedication.
I feel like I owe it to you, and I owe it to just everybody listening right now.
What is Fire Island? It sounds really intense, or it's a Banksy installation. What is that?
It's a part of Long Island, outside of New York City. It's a very long kind of like sand dune, I guess is what it's. I looked at a formation of it over the course of like 100 years, and it went from being very small to a very large sand dune that has a lighthouse built on it. I think it's one of the oldest lighthouses in New York State.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's like it's the one between Montauk and whatever is closer to New York.
Well, let me ask you a question, because last time I was in Michigan with my girlfriend over the summer, we went to Sleeping Bear Dunes, which are very, very big dunes, and I had her take a couple of photos for me, hopefully to replace my Twitter photos. That didn't come to be, but I wanted shots that made it look like I was on Tatooine. Did you do the same thing, or am I just crazy?
I did walk out onto the beach today, and because there's still snow on the ground here in New York, especially out on Long Island, and I walked out into the sand dunes, and there was just some snow, and I was like, this could be like a polar ice cap if Tatooine had polar ice caps right now, or like it was very nice looking. I wanted to film like a Star Wars episode, and then I started reenacting Planet of the Apes at one point when we came across like a giant ship's mast. It was
That's so cool.
Yeah, I pretended it was the Statue of Liberty.
That's pretty neat, and a lot less lame than me begging my girlfriend to take photos of me in the sand.
That sounds risque.
It wasn't so bad. So let's do some follow up.
It sounds like you had a big week. You made a special appearance on a podcast. Is that true?
I did. Yeah. My friend Deanna is a host of a Modern Vinyl Network podcast called Misaligned. She had me on there to kind of talk about some music stuff. You and I are both very involved in the music scene, and I've done a lot of freelance writing and PR in the music scene over the years. So she had me on to talk about some of that, and share some tips on different PR strategies that you could use to get coverage. And I use that as a little bit of practice for a couple of panels that I'm going to be on at South by Southwest this year. So it was a good opportunity to sort of get some of that out there and test the waters for that sort of talk. And then at the end of it, we talked about podcasting and sort of our methods that we use for our show and how we could, sort of improve her show as well. And then, she gave me a little chance to plug the show here. So, Bantha Fodder is getting around.
I'm happy about that.
On a related topic, we've had a couple of reviews come in. I checked on iTunes the other day, and we have at least 2 reviews, and both are 5 stars, which is awesome. Thank you to those people.
5 stars.
Very much appreciate it.
I'm blushing right now. I want everyone to know that I'm blushing.
It's great. They called us quirky and charismatic. I like that.
Who's quirky and who's charismatic, though?
I don't know. You can decide. What do you want to be?
Quirky reminds me of Joey from Friends, so I like Joey, so I would be quirky.
Okay, I'll take the charisma, if that means I'm Chandler.
Yeah, you can be Chandler, I'll be Joey.
That's settled.
Okay.
Last night, I went out with my girlfriend, and apart from visiting the Cheesecake Factory, where I had an amazing shepherd's pie, I also went to see a movie called Star Wars The Force Awakens in IMAX.
Oh, is that new?
Yeah, it just came out sometime this winter. This is actually my 3rd time seeing it. I think we may have talked about some of that before. Does that ring a bell?
I didn't know they were doing more Star Wars movies. That's weird.
Yeah, well, episode 7 is out. If you haven't seen it, I think you should probably go see it.
I'll be honest with you. I've seen it once.
Oh, that's right. We had a whole episode about this. In fact, there's an entire challenge and web page dedicated to the fact that you've only seen it one time and that you should probably go back and see it again. Have you done that?
I haven't yet. It's on my to-do list. I got a lot going on this week. My bro's coming into town, and we.
Okay. All right. That's fine. No pressure. There's a timer for this. I don't need to reiterate.
It's counting up. It's not counting down, right?
Right.
If you change it to counting down, I'm going to get really anxious. I don't know what's going to happen at the end of that countdown.
Well, I don't want to give you a heart attack because I do want you to see episode 8 when that comes out. So, we'll check back in with you. But, I went and saw episode 7 again last night. It was my third time. I actually haven't seen it since opening night, so that was kind of nice. I went and saw it 2 times opening night, as we talked about, I believe, in episode 1. But it was cool to see it in IMAX. It was a little bit bigger than my first showing, and the sound was definitely a lot better. And there were 4 couples in the movie theater, so we kind of had the place mostly to ourselves, and it was pretty sweet.
So 8 people in total in this theater.
It was pretty cool. The movie's still great. I love it. I picked up on a couple of tiny things here and there that I didn't see before, but really all over, I was just, really enjoying the movie. I really, really, really like The Force Awakens. It's so fun.
I'm getting psyched to see it again. I know this is breaking character maybe a little bit even, but no, I am actually getting excited to go see The Force Awakens again.
Well, make the time. I think you'll enjoy it. Like, it's, I don't know, I don't really know what to say about it. Like, a lot of people have been using its similarities to A New Hope as sort of like a point of, I don't know, contention with the film. Like, some people seem to be really upset that a lot of the plot points are sort of rehashes of A New Hope. But I see that as a strength, because when I watch this movie, I feel the same way that I do when I watch A New Hope. Like, it's a fun adventure. There's not, like, there's story going on, and, like, there's definitely more that you want to know. But as a self-contained movie, it's really fun, and there are awesome highs and awesome lows, and it's just all over. It's enjoyable to watch from start to finish. And I don't plan on going to see it again in theaters. I think that's the end of the run. I probably won't see it again until sometime this spring when they put it out on Blu-ray or DVD. But
you're totally going to surprise me. I know it. You're going to come out of nowhere and be like, next week, and be like, oh, I saw it. I just had to see it again. I'm sorry. I went and saw it a 4th time. It just, I saw it twice in one night again. I couldn't help myself. I couldn't help myself. It just happened.
I don't know. I did tell myself that I wanted to see it in at least 4 times in 4 formats. I wanted to see it in 3D, in Cinemark's Real D, 3D, XD, as I saw it the first time, in IMAX, and then in standard digital. So who knows? Maybe I'll pop by my local theater on my next day off and see it in standard digital. But you know what? I'm going to give it another week or 2 at the very least if I see it again at all, because I want to put a little time in between, and I don't want to overdo it, because really, seeing it 2 days in a row after you've seen it twice already, what are you really getting out of it at that point? Not a whole lot.
Oh, man.
Let's move on to our topic for the night. Is that all right?
Yeah. I'm
cool.
actually way more pumped to talk about this than I thought I would be. Which
really,
yeah,
I mean, we'll give the listeners a little background. What are we talking about tonight?
We're talking about the book, a young adult novel released prior to The Force Awakens, titled "Weapon of a Jedi."
I was kind of surprised when you said you wanted to talk about this, because when we were kind of setting up the basis of the show and kind of outlining the things that we wanted to talk about, you seemed a little hesitant to kind of want to dissect the books and go into all that, because so many, shows do it, and we wanted to try to set us apart. But you seem pretty interested in this one. I kind of let you pick which book you might want to talk about first, and this is the one that you jumped to. What changed?
Well, I mean, not a whole lot changed, but I'll be honest. The reason I beeline straight for this one is because I saw The Weapon of a Jedi, and I saw it was a Luke Skywalker adventure, and in my head, I had not looked at the book cover, not read the back of it or anything like that. In my head, I'm just saying, oh, this is going to happen post Return of the Jedi. And I was really excited to know anything I can about what Luke Skywalker does canonically.
Okay.
After Return of the Jedi. Lo and behold, this is not something that happens. I mean, part of it, I guess, happens post Return of the Jedi, but it does not happen. The meat of the story does not take place.
Right.
So I was disappointed on that front, but I did arrive at another idea that I really wanted to address with reviewing these books. Something that I really wanted to tackle is kind of the question of, because in my head, reviewing books is just like, oh, is it good or is it bad? And I really didn't want to make this about that. I wanted to kind of ask that question in a different form, which is this book worth reading?
Yeah.
Which, I mean, you could do that for any media, but this specifically, I wanted to address this question: is this book worth reading? And I think over the course of this episode, we're going to come up with that answer.
I think is this worth reading is a much better question than is this good? Because at the heart of it, digging into these books, which are now considered canon, it's more about what the books add to the story rather than how well they're written, because all of these books are going to be written by different people. So far, there are already a half dozen authors contributing to the canonical story through these books, whether they be the adult novels or the young adult novels, or even the comic books for that matter. There's a whole bunch of people involved, and everybody's going to have their own style of writing. So I think to judge a story based on how well it's written is sort of irrelevant, because no matter how well it's written, it's part of the story. It's sort of like the prequels. They weren't made in the best way, maybe, but it's part of the story and it's important. So I think, is this worth reading is a better question to ask before you actually start reading a book. So we'll dig through that. We'll kind of get into it, and maybe at the end of it we can sort of come up with an answer as to whether or not this book in particular was worth reading. But before we do that, let's kind of dig into this book sort of at a macro level and kind of detail exactly what it's about. So this book, Weapon of a Jedi by Jason Fry, is it's part of a 3-part series of books, and this was part of the sort of Journey to the Force Awakens book series that was coming out. Aftermath was included in that. Lost Stars was included in that. But these books in particular, they sort of detail little tiny stories that happen somewhere around the time of the original trilogy, and they're all about the 3 main heroes from the original trilogy. So this one's about Luke. There's another one called Smuggler's Run about Han Solo, and there's one called Moving Target about Leia. And they're all just they're fun little books. They're young adult novels, so they're really not hard to read. They're just little stories that add a little bit of background to each character, and just add a little something extra to the story.
It fills in a little bit of space and kind of bring some new things to light about the original trilogy.
Absolutely. Stuff that we may not have even questioned to begin with, but it's interesting that they can just pop these things in there, and it adds so much. This one definitely gave some plot development, or rather some character development to Luke, which really plays into the latter movies, the latter 2 movies in the original trilogy. So again, this was written by Jason Fry. He's a popular author. He's done some Star Wars books. He did Moving Target with Cecil Castellucci. He wrote some Rebels books, and he also wrote Rey's Survival Guide. So he's dipped his toes into both the early Star Wars canon and the later Star Wars canon.
Something I also like about these books is that there's also an artist incorporated into this, which I feel like doesn't happen a lot, that an artist of notoriety kind of gets included in these mostly text-heavy books. But
what do you know about this guy?
I know what you've told me, which is his name is Phil Noto. He's an artist for Disney. He did a lot of the old movies like Mulan, Hunchback of Notre Dame, and he's also did some DC and Marvel books.
Yeah, he's awesome. This guy is seriously sweet. I love his art. If I could commission something by him, that would be amazing. So Phil's been the artist for all 3 of these young adult novels. So he did the one for Han, Luke, and Leia. He also did Before the Awakening, which has 3 kind of similar small stories about Finn, Rey, and Poe Dameron, which is really cool. He also did art for a bunch of the new Marvel comics like Star Wars and Princess Leia, Vader, Chewbacca, Kanan, Shattered Empire, and the new Poe Dameron comic that's coming out. So this guy's been very, very busy, and Disney has been commissioning a ton of his work, and he's awesome.
How have you been reading these books?
I've been reading them on iBooks, and this has been sort of like a big thing in my life lately. I've written a couple things on my blog, which I can link here, but I was reading on Kindle. But since I buy all of the books physically, so I actually have them for like my bookshelf, it doesn't make any sense for me to buy the Kindle editions as well. It's a lot of money that I just don't have. So what I've been doing is buying the physical books, and I've been renting them through Overdrive, which is like a library ebook service where you can kind of just borrow books digitally like you would if you were to walk into a library. And you can just get it sent to your Kindle, which is great. But there are titles on there that are not available, and sometimes you just don't want to wait. And then, once you get the book and you write some notes down, once the borrowing period ends, like you can't open the book again and you lose all your notes. So that just wasn't working for me. So what I've been doing is maybe a little less kosher, and I've been finding copies of these books digitally, EPUBs and Mobies, and I've been converting them and putting them into Kindle, and then that way I can save all my notes and whatnot. But, long story short, that solution just wasn't working for me for several reasons, which were outlined in these posts. So I switched to iBooks, where everything works perfectly. It's a lot more simple, and that's where I've been doing it, and it's great.
You mentioned an update coming soon for iBooks that might help out with cloud syncing and kind of across multiple devices.
Yeah, the way it is now, like I use Macintosh computers and iPhones, so when you're in Apple's ecosystem, they kind of make it easy to sort of keep everything the same no matter where you are. And right now, their iBook solution it's okay. It could be better, and I think they have an update coming out soon to fix that. But as of now, like you can sync your notes and your bookmarks and your place in the story, but you have to like sync the books themselves through iTunes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping that this new iCloud update will allow you to just sort of sync the books through the iBooks app on the Mac instead of having to go through iTunes and like actually tell iTunes which books you want on there, because I think that's sort of silly.
That would make life a lot easier for a lot of people, I think.
So much easier.
Yeah.
You could just keep all your books in the cloud. That would be amazing.
And I mean, not to mention multiple devices. Like if I'm commuting on the subway, I want to be able to pop open a book, when I have a minute of cellular data or whatever, and just be able to import all my bookmarks, notes, spots, whatever I'm doing. And because I don't carry my iPad with me every day.
Right. Yeah, I keep my iPad in my backpack, so when I go to work and I go on break, I'll take my iPad with me because it's a little bit nicer to read on a bigger screen. But if I don't have it with me and, I have like a couple minutes, in the passenger seat of a car or waiting in line at the grocery store or waiting for my food or something, I'll just pop it open on my cell phone and I'll read it there too. So it's really nice to have all that kind of like synced up and everywhere, especially with the notes. Like that's so nice. I love just being able to highlight something in a book and pop the notes in there and keep reading.
Yeah.
It's so much better than having to pull out a notebook and scroll down some notes and then switch back to the book and back and forth and where's a pen and all that jazz.
I almost wish I could go back to grade school again and just, be able to take classes with an iPad or something like that at this point.
Gosh, could you imagine?
Take notes. Oh, man.
Those kids have it easy.
Whippersnappers.
Yeah. All right, Mike. Well, I think that's some good background on the book. Again, this is Weapon of a Jedi, written by Jason Fry and illustrated by Phil Noto. If you want to read the book for yourself and you haven't yet, this might be a good time to stop the podcast and go read it. Then you can come back and kind of get our thoughts on it. Otherwise, I say we dig in.
We're going to be spoiling Force Awakens stuff too, so heads up on that too, just if you haven't seen it yet.
There's going to be a point where we're going to stop giving the spoiler warnings for The Force Awakens, because if you haven't seen it yet, you're crazy. I don't know why you'd be four episodes into a podcast about Star Wars and not seen the new one.
Honestly, I feel like my mom listens to this and I don't think she's seen it yet.
Mike's mom, come on.
Get on it,
Stop
Mom.
the podcast. All right. Well, let's dig in.
Okay. Tell me your first impression from the book. Like you're in the first chapter of this, even because there's a prologue to this book that takes place post Return of the Jedi, which I was really excited about at first, but then my heart sank.
Okay.
But reading this book, prologue into the first chapter, what is your gut reaction immediately? How are you feeling as you're moving through this?
So it opens up on this girl who we know is Blue 3, and she is sort of hanging around the base, and she kind of got stuck on like droid software update duty. So she's like going around and like plugging into all these droids around the base and like making sure that all their firmware is up to date and everything. When C-3PO comes by, and you know how C-3PO does, he offers his assistance even when it's not necessary. So they kind of meet up, and that's cool. And I think this might have been a little different for me because I knew how the other book was structured.
Right.
And it didn't take a whole lot for me to figure out that this wasn't necessarily where the story was going to take place. This takes place after Jedi, and after she gets talking to C-3PO, I can see that there is going to be some sort of flashback. And I think that's probably about the time where Mike was like, oh... Yeah. This isn't what I thought.
I mean, I will be honest, I did not know this was a young adult novel going into it. I had no clue.
Really?
I hadn't looked at the cover art, so I hadn't seen like the comic type images on the front of it.
Okay.
And I imagined I was going into something more aftermathy or like more, Lost Stars, or just like going back to the old Legends books that I used to love. I thought I was going into something a little bit heavier and heftier, and so when I saw there was only like a 2-hour read time on this book tops, I was like, okay, well, this is definitely not what I was expecting. But yeah, the young adult nature of this book was not apparent to me at first.
That's interesting. How far did you get?
I got probably maybe 4 Kindle pages in, which is like just being like, wait a second, why is 3PO talking like this? Why is this such like it was a very soft narration in the sense that it was this happens, that happens, which is not to say that it was bad. It was just to say that it was very...
It's a little more simple.
Yeah, it was kind of just demonstrative. It just wants to say, like, this is happening right now, and she felt this way.
And that's not to say it's poorly written at all. I think Jason Fry is an amazing writer. I really like his style, and even though this was kind of, like, directed towards a younger crowd, like, it's very easy to read, and it's very enjoyable. But I know what you mean, where it's, the language is a little more... it's a little softer. It's a little more basic. It's not as like technically driven as maybe Aftermath is or something like that. And it's a lot easier to follow. But
no, I mean he knows his audience. He knows his audience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
yeah, I can see how you'd
intended.
be a little confused when you started the book.
I mean, it was young adult to an extent. I mean, there is this one section that I feel like I have to read. It was something like it blew my mind the first time I read it, and I had to go back and read this paragraph over and over again. Can I read an excerpt for everyone at home right now?
Hit me.
Okay, all right. This is this is after the flashback has begun, which we will get to why it's happening. But this is an excerpt from the book Weapon of a Jedi.
Luke eased the X-Wing beneath the freighter, goosing the retro rockets as a flexible docking tube descended from the larger ship's underside, like the questing tentacle of some great beast. The tube locked itself over the X-Wing's cockpit and droid socket, clamping tight. Once R2 tweeted they were successfully docked, Luke popped his cockpit's canopy and clambered up a flexible ladder in the tube, waving to R2 where he waited in the fighter's droid socket.
Mike, I feel so dirty after hearing that.
Yeah, I mean, do not tell me that you didn't hear that the first time.
Not at all.
Like, what is that language? What is all that language right there? Like,
oh my god. I'm gonna have to change the rating on this on iTunes.
Look, I didn't say any dirty words, but like that is some weird description right there.
Well, I feel a little less than clean.
There's also like some I just feel like sometimes writers like to try and get away with stuff, and like that, I feel like he was sitting there just being like just typing away, being like, let's see what I could do here with metaphor.
So how does that make you feel?
Well, okay, so jokes aside, that was one of the more descriptive passages in the book, and I actually enjoyed that kind of stuff. There was a lot of technical stuff in this book that was brought to me, and it made me happy because this is canon now. There are things in here that I hadn't read before, things I didn't remember reading in Michael Stackpole's, I think, mid-'90s or early 2000s X-Wing series. Things about, like, the hyperspace jump coordinates that they throw in there. I thought that was really fascinating, like Star Wars fact that they kind of dropped on me. I'm sure, much more intense fans than me know about that. They know, like, okay, yeah, hyperdrive jumps for all Rebellion pilots are all calculated, and they do multiple jump points to avoid detection or like ratting out their base or whatever. But I thought
that was pretty interesting.
I thought it was fun just having that established and canonized essentially, because that's what everything we're reading now is becoming canon. Like there are characters that are introduced that are part of the universe now.
Yeah, that point was cool. I didn't even leave any notes for that, but reading that first section, I definitely thought that this was like right up Mike's alley. There's X-Wings and there's dogfights. Like that's totally the kind of stuff that you'd enjoy.
That's where I was still under the impression it was not a young adult novel yet.
Yeah, I could totally see that. And then when they get to the part where they're like scrambling their hyperspace patterns and whatnot, and they're doing multiple jumps, in case they are being followed, it's a little less. It's a little more difficult for the Empire to kind of follow them back to base. I thought that was so cool. And when I was watching The Force Awakens again last night, that kind of popped into my head. When the First Order ends up following Snap Wexley's back to the Resistance base, I'm like, well, what the hell, Snap? Like, didn't you follow protocol? Didn't you do a couple jumps before you got back home?
The Resistance has been easing it up lately, I guess.
I guess so. And it sucks because Snap Wexley is a character from one of the new canon novels. He was first revealed in Aftermath. He's actually a character in that book, which is a cool little tidbit that I picked up in the Force Awakens Visual Dictionary by Pablo Hidalgo. That's so cool. But anyway, moving on. Like, I loved all that dogfight stuff, and I knew that this was going to be something that you actually liked, and whether or not it was what you might have expected, I knew that was going to draw you in.
It did, and it did. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I definitely attacked this book from a bunch of different perspectives. One of them being, as a fan of fighter pilots and the whole X-Wing lore. And then the other as like a literary aspect, as like, just a critical analysis of the writing. I mean, we've already talked about the plots a little bit in this. Let's go ahead and quickly frame for listeners. Okay, so the outside story, the prologue and epilogue, is taking place out in post Return of the Jedi,
and that's with Blue 3 and C-3PO.
Yes, the pilot Blue 3, and 3PO has a red arm at this point, which to me was like that was like a punch in the face really quickly, and not a great way. Like you and I had this discussion a while ago, 3PO's red arm, whether it was something that we liked or whether it was something we didn't like. And I feel like there was a lot of different reactions to that.
Yeah, I've read a little more about that. Again, in that visual dictionary that I mentioned before, there was actually a little tidbit in there about the arm, and more of this is going to be kind of filled in with one of the one-off comics that Marvel's going to produce just on C-3PO, but just this one little excerpt I think is worth mentioning just as a little tangent here. C-3PO is uncharacteristically quiet when it comes to discussing his salvaged arm. It's a memento of another droid's sacrifice.
Wow.
So that's less of a description and more of a teaser, I think, but sort of an interesting little thing, but definitely sort of sets the scene, because that's a very, very different look for C-3PO that we now can only associate with The Force Awakens. So it kind of takes you to that area of time that we don't know about after Jedi. And, we don't know exactly how far in the future this is, but that's sort of where the story opens up.
It seems like that's also where we are. I mean, this is Journey to the Force Awakens, right? So, so this is they do mention R2 is in his whatever it's called, like his low power mode at this point. That is mentioned in the book. So this is, I guess, prior to Force Awakens, but post Red Arm C-3PO. I some people enjoyed. Like, I had the reaction to the red arm being like, this is a detail that's being thrown in like every new canon comic and novel. Like, they're definitely setting something up and wanting to make us curious about it. But then I spoke to a friend after he saw the movie, and he was kind of like, oh, well, I mean, I didn't even think about that at all. I didn't even think about the marketing behind it or like the direction that they're trying to point people in. I just thought it was a really funny joke, when C-3PO says, oh, like, you must not have recognized me because of my red arm. Like, I didn't think of that as a marketing tactic. I thought it was a great joke, which I think it was on its own. But for me, it was too, like, it took me out of the movie for a second to just think about all of the other things that, like, oh, they're just trying to make you curious about the arm. They want you to read the novels. They want you to read the comic books. It stuck out to me more than it did to other people, I guess.
I think some of that is true for sure, but I also think that it's also kind of it's kind of a cool little device to kind of set the scene, where in the movie it sort of seemed like a weird sort of maybe product placement sort of line. Yeah. In this book, it definitely kind of benefits the story, because it instead of taking up paragraphs and paragraphs to sort of set the stage of when and where the story takes place, the red arm sums it up in one line. Just one little description kind of tells you where this is happening, and I think that's beneficial.
There's this other kind of idea of this book. So the prologue and epilogue are post Return of the Jedi. The interior is shortly after A New Hope. Right. So with that comes the idea that you have a narrator that is speaking, and it's third person. As it's written in the book, third-person omniscient narration. But it does seem a little limited at the same time. The story is framed from 3PO telling it, but it's third-person omniscient narration with a lot of dialogue. One thing that popped up to me a lot is kind of the devices, like the devices that we see in the film for R2-D2's communication. Whereas I think in other Star Wars novels, I've heard R2-D2 actually have a voice before. Like we have a lot of synonyms being thrown in here for making noise, and they use the whole like R2-D2 tweets, tootled, chortled is another word that they throw up in there, and and somebody else has to repeat his question. Somebody else has to repeat
Right.
Or kind of like answer in a way that that someone has to answer in a way that describes what he said or repeats his question or comment.
Yeah, this has been kind of common in a lot of the books or the comics even that I've read so far with Chewbacca. It's all the same. So in the Force Awakens novelization, it's the same thing for Chewbacca. You know, he makes noises and all, but it's the same as in the movies. And I think that's what they're really trying to get to. At least a lot of the writers that I really enjoy, they try to write the book in the way that the movie might play out in your head, and it kind of helps you visualize it a little bit more, because that's exactly what happens when you're talking to R2-D2, unless you're in the cockpit, you know?
Right.
And it seems like the connection is a little better, and he can like read readouts and everything, but when people understand what the droids are saying, they can have a discussion, and we don't necessarily need to know exactly what words they're using, just that they are saying something and that the people that they're talking to understand.
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, there's a reason why they do it that way. But for me, you know, I would love to hear just like a droid speaking, you know, and being part of a conversation, because I feel like in Empire Strikes Back we have Luke on Dagobah with R2 having conversations outside the cockpit and things like that, so they can communicate somehow, but. I don't know. I just think it's kind of cool.
Yeah, it is. So jumping back into the story, that's sort of the way that this whole thing's set up. But getting back into the story after Luke has sort of, he's done this whole dogfight with Wedge Antilles, which is pretty cool. How excited were you for that?
I like seeing Wedge, but Wedge is a different person from how I know him at this point, because all I know of him is the X-Wing, the Legends novels, where he was very fleshed out as a character and very intense and kind of drill sergeant in nature, kind of this legendary figure of the rebellion post Return of the Jedi. And now he's, we see him back again. He's Luke's wingman, and I just think it's a different character, but I'm excited to reform this person in my head. It's like a reboot. This is a reboot in my head.
The way that they kind of frame this character now, I don't have any sort of frame of reference for how he was in the Legends novels, but to me, his connection with Luke is so strong in such like a cool, buddy sort of way. And it reminds me of how Luke interacted with Biggs, from the original trilogy. And there wasn't a whole lot of Biggs in the original trilogy with his sort of famous cut scenes, but they made it pretty clear that he and Luke were pretty good friends back on Tatooine, and that when they got to fight with each other in the rebellion, that was sort of a cool thing. And it kind of seems like now, since he and Wedge have gone through so much together and lost so many people, they've sort of solidified their bond a bit more, and that makes them even better in the field of fight. So the opening part, they're kind of like dodging and weaving back and forth behind each other, popping out to pop some shots at some TIE fighters while the other one in front.
I love that description of combat. Yeah.
Yeah, puts all the shields up front to block them. That's so cool. I thought that was really fun. But from there, the story moves on a little bit, and like you're saying, they're going back to the base, and that gives Luke a little time to sort of to contemplate and think back at where he's been so far. So at this point, they've destroyed the Death Star, and he's this big star, and he's not necessarily enjoying that sort of notoriety, and it's put a target on his back, and that's putting some pressure on him to sort of get back into the lessons that Ben was teaching him before he left in becoming a Jedi. And while he's kind of rolling back to the base on his hyperspace jumps, he's thinking back to the first lesson that he had just hours after the murder of his aunt and uncle by stormtroopers. When Luke and Ben were on their way back to Mos Eisley, they stopped for the night, and that's where he has his first lessons as a Jedi. And I think that was that at that point I really got into this book, and I kind of knew what this book was going to be, and I really, really enjoyed that bit that they added to the story, because you never would have thought about that. In the movie, there's just a wipe, one of George Lucas's wipes across the screen where it just changes the scene, and it's the same time of day as it was before. So as far as we know, the distance between Luke's homestead and Mos Eisley isn't that far, and they were able to get there fairly quickly in the land speeder. But this shows that there's a lot more distance there than you initially realized. So even from the Tosche station, where Luke was living was very far out from civilization, even if Mos Eisley isn't that big. So setting that distance and sort of broadening that horizon of scene building is really cool, and it also embellishes the story that much more, because we don't see Luke with Ben very much. The only bit of training that we saw was on board the Falcon, and they mentioned that a couple times here, but at least now we know through this novel that there was more to it than that. He learned a little more from Ben than had led on, but as we learn later in the story, that may not have been enough.
I mean, the Luke we see in this book is a really unsure and kind of despondent Luke. Like he's definitely, you know, he knows he's a good pilot still.
Mm-hmm.
He blew up the Death Star. Him and Wedge are the only survivors of that. So he definitely has a lot on his shoulders as far as responsibility to the rebellion goes in terms of being a pilot. But he definitely feels that other pressure of being the last of the Jedi. I mean, there are numerous references in the book to that, and just about how he feels like he'll never get anywhere. And I think that is such a... Because we got to see Luke in Empire Strikes Back as, you know, we're not really sure where he's at the beginning. He's definitely not trained. You know, Ben appears to him and tells him to go to Dagobah. But he seems more sure of himself in that Tauntaun. Mm-hmm. He's just like, he's a scout, you know, he's got some skill with the lightsaber in the Wampa Cave. But in this book, Weapon of a Jedi, he's definitely just has no idea how to do anything, mm-hmm. but he wants to do something. He's like a child who can't talk, you know, it's just like a baby learning to speak. He's so frustrated that he can't make any noise, but he's just reaching out with anything he has, whether it's screaming or crying or whatever. And I just think that's a really cool Luke that we haven't seen yet. Because in Return of the Jedi, he is like brimming with evil, you know, like at the beginning, choking out the Gamorrean guards at Jabba's palace. And he's just, and that's a sure Luke. That's someone who knows he's going to Jabba's palace to get his friend back. But in this book, he's just someone who's like, all right, I'm just another pilot for the rebellion, and I'm the last of a whole class of people.
You brought up a cool note there that I was thinking about, but I didn't actually highlight anywhere because it kept popping up. He keeps bringing up that moment where, you know, he heard Ben in the trenches of the Death Star, and it told him to let go and to like embrace the Force to destroy the Death Star, which is what he ended up doing. That was the first time that he heard Ben's voice, and you know, he's starting to hear it again later on in the story, but he's feeling all of these pulls in the Force, and he doesn't know what it means. He feels lost and directionless because he doesn't have anybody to teach him. So he's having to sort of find his way through the Force on his own, which is sort of scary for him, and it's sort of it makes him feel very lonely, I think. You know, like you said, his self-confidence is super low, even though he did this amazing thing, because he did it with the guidance of his master and of the Force. He didn't do it on his own, and now that he's sort of on his own again and silence is sort of surrounding him and he's unsure of what to do next, that leads you further into this book with that kind of in the back of your head, like, you know, what's going to happen with Luke in his training? Like, how is he going to become the Jedi Master that he feels that he has to be to rebuild the Jedi Order? How is that going to happen?
And that question kind of gets answered a little bit, which I think is another one of those moments in this book that reframes how you look at something from a later movie. We hear mm-hmm. Ben again, like he did in the Death Star trench, speaking to Luke during a moment in this book where Luke is looking for help, looking for guidance. We hear Ben's voice again come to Luke, mm-hmm. Seemingly out of nowhere. And that kind of reframes it to me. I don't know if I don't think there are any apparitions in this book as far as his Force ghost appearing.
No.
But we do hear guidance, like saying what you need to do in this book and to become a Jedi. And I think that in my past viewing of Empire Strikes Back, when Luke is crawling through the snow after the Wampa Cave, when Han finds him, my impression was that this is the first time Ben Kenobi is appearing to Luke. Obviously in a visible form, but also this is him offering guidance. But it's great to see that, you know, something happened in between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, and this apparition to Luke on Hoth is no longer something random. It's something that we can we say, oh, okay, so like, oh, Ben's talking to me again. Not like, oh my gosh, Obi-Wan Kenobi.
It's not so much of a surprise. It's more like, oh, like Ben, like you're here, like you're going to help me, and then he disappears, and then he feels abandoned again. It's this reoccurring thing now that keeps happening, and I don't know. I don't really know how to explain it, because like Luke is such an important character to the series, like we've talked about so many times already in the show, but so much of his story is sort of untold. We see him in these chapters of his life between the original trilogy movies where he's just this farm boy, and then, you know, he's this rebel hero, and he can all of a sudden use a lightsaber, which he was never really able to do before. And then again, like, he's all of a sudden a Jedi, and he's using force tricks. Like, all of these things sort of come about in stages, but we don't see the development of that. But in this book, like, this perfectly fills the gap for me between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. And the Force dreams that he's having in this book fill that in, and the sort of little lessons that he's getting from Ben in his ear are sort of getting in, and the background even before that. Like, Ben was sort of describing the way that the Force works, and that it's more like pouring a cup of water, that you have to make yourself an empty vessel in order for the Force to sort of fill you up. And that way you learn to let your emotions go. That way you can empty yourself out and let the Force fill you and flow through you, so that you can fully harness that power and use it to feel everything around you and to guide you. And that's something that we would have never had without these books. And it just keeps hammering that home through the entire book when he finally gets to the Jedi Temple in the middle of the woods, and he finds his way through, and he sees this old carving on the wall, and he's seeing the Jedi doing that, and then he's, you know, learning to wield his lightsaber the correct way there. All of these things sort of form together this better picture of how the events from Empire came to be. You know, he wasn't a fully formed Jedi at that point, but he definitely had some ability, and this is where all that starts to fill in.
The idea of harnessing the Force, I thought, like, while it gives great perspective on the original trilogy, I think going back to The Force Awakens, it kind of does service to Force Awakens in the sense that, you know, that one quote you mentioned a second ago, harnessing the Force, what Ben says to Luke. One of the pull quotes I have is, to harness the Force, you must first feel it everywhere. And all I could think of at that moment was Rey, in her moment battling with Kylo Ren at the finale of Force Awakens.
Right, when she's like, "Oh yeah, the Force," and she just closes her eyes, and yeah.
Well, to harness the Force, you must first feel it everywhere. So she's been feeling something, just like Luke has been kind of going through this whole book. Whether he's doing the hyperspace jumps, whether he's kind of on this planet, feeling some pull in his Force dreams, he's feeling these things, and he knows it's the Force because he knows the Force exists. And thinking back on Rey's awakening, until Kylo Ren says, like, I can teach you the ways of the Force, she's like, oh wow, the Force is what is happening here, oh my gosh. And then she's harnessed it in that sense because she's feeling this thing, this thing she didn't know. She has a name for it and understands what she has a hold of at this point. Whereas before,
absolutely,
I thought it was a nice kind of like tie-in, whether it was intentional or not. I think it fits really well into what happens later on as far as, you know, how a Jedi harnesses their powers.
I totally agree with that, and I think it definitely helps out Rey's story in The Force Awakens, but there are still points of that I just can't get down with. You know, I don't at all agree with the whole Mary Sue comment about Rey. You know, she's not perfect. Like, she's not an amazing pilot. Like, she knows her stuff with mechanics because she spends her entire life digging through old Empire machines, but she was crashing the Millennium Falcon all over, and even though she has, like, the Force in her, and that obviously seems to help her abilities in some way, you know, she's not perfect. And even though this book sort of shows you a little bit about how a Force-sensitive person kind of comes into their abilities without any training, I'm still not too down with the whole thing where Rey's able to convince that trooper to, like, let her go and drop his weapon. You know, there's a quote in this book where it says, Luke wished desperately that he had Ben Kenobi's ability to cloud minds with the Force, but that knowledge had vanished along with the old Jedi's body. But that didn't stop Rey. You know, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, how is she able to do that without any training?
This may be something we can expand upon later, but I think just to address that idea of the force trick, the mind trick. I mean, at this point, it's been 30 years since Return of the Jedi. Since Jedis are a legend to Rey, and so surely she has to know about their tricks, about what Jedis are rumored to be able to do. So I think this is kind of one of those things we have to say, we don't know everything about Rey's backstory. We don't know what she knows about Jedis. We don't know what the universe, what the galaxy knows about Jedis. So I think she might just be trying something. It's just her taking a shot in the dark, being like, oh, I heard Jedis have this power. So maybe it's kind of like how Finn just kind of says, we can use the Force.
That's not how the Force works.
Yeah, that's a great moment. And I think that's just kind of like the millennials, I guess, of the Star Wars universe at this point in time are kind of just like, oh yeah, well the Force is this thing we got. And I don't think Rey's is or Finn or that dumb, but I do think that they have a very general knowledge of the Force.
Maybe they're just a bit naive.
But also just they know what they know. I know very little about a lot of things, so maybe that's kind of where Rey's coming from. She's like, well, and she just happens to strike gold with that, because of whatever is coming in the future.
Absolutely. Just before we kind of progress the story a little bit further, you have to introduce a couple more characters. So Luke is he's going out on this mission with C-3PO and R2-D2, and they sort of get waylaid by some Imperial forces and have to turn back. And before they can get back to their base, they have to sort of make a pit stop at this planet called Devaron, where Luke was feeling this force pull, and he couldn't really explain it, but he knew that's where he had to go. So he landed there, and his ship was damaged, so he had to have it be fixed by a local, and in the meantime he took Hostel at a hotel, and he's trying to find a guide to take him to the forest, where he learns there is an old Jedi temple. Now the thing is, nobody wants to take him there. They're all too scared to go there, so they sort of ignore him, and he has to find help by way of the scavenger named Sarko Plank.
Sarko Plank, I mean, there is a picture of him later on in the book, which definitely demolished what I was forming him to look like. But at first description, I was kind of thinking Cad Bane from the Clone Wars.
So you were thinking more of maybe a bounty hunter sort of cowboy type?
Mostly the breathing apparatus kind of stuck out to me, yeah. And I think he kind of, his personality definitely went in that direction, but his looks. You said you have an action figure of Sarko Plank?
Yeah, I do. I have an action figure of Sarko Plank, and it's in the Force Awakens packaging because he is in the Force Awakens, and that was a bit of a spoiler for the book for me. Obviously I knew that he was going to live after the point where he kind of turns on Luke, but he's at the Nema outpost in The Force Awakens. At some point, he found himself on Jakku, and that's sort of where he hunkered down to do his thing.
And you see him there. Oh, wow.
Yeah, just barely. I'm not even sure if you actually see him in the movie. I think I looked for it last night, but I can't remember for sure if he's there. But he's definitely in the background, at least at some point. But yeah, like you said, his description in this book is something. I don't know. I took something different. I didn't see Cad Bane, but Fry describes Plank's faceplate as unsettlingly of overgrown toenails.
Wow, what a description.
It's totally not how I would have described it, but it definitely gives you a little idea of what you're looking at. Plus, it kind of puts this idea of disgust in your head, which maybe is some foreshadowing. I'm not sure, but I thought that was lovely.
I will honestly say that's the first time I've ever heard that descriptor of anything. So kudos to Fry on that one.
So Luke, he meets the scavenger named Sarko Plank, who agrees to take him into the Force for a fee. And Sarko Plank seems to be the guy who kind of does anything for a buck. He's not necessarily like a smuggler type like Han Solo, but he finds stuff and he sells them to people. He's definitely a little bit shady. He's a lot mysterious, and
he plays dirty.
Yeah.
According to some of the other characters in the book, the people he guides don't come back sometimes.
Yeah, he's not well liked. He made it pretty clear from the outset that he was sort of outcast by his own people, and he sort of chose a life to mirror that. So he's sort of out for his own, and he definitely is a lot greedy and wants to kind of get whatever he can to pay his debts and to make a profit. So he takes Luke into the forest, and that's where Luke finds a secret entrance to the Jedi Temple, which is not being monitored by the Empire, which destroyed the Jedi Temple years and years ago. So he finds his way in there while Sarko Plank sort of waits outside. But there is a point where he sort of comes back into the story, and at first you think he's a hero, and later, he shows his true colors, where he is definitely a villain. And we'll get to that in just a second. But I think it's definitely important to sort of give some background as to who the other main character of this book sort of is before we actually get into the temple and what Luke was doing there. So when Luke gets inside, he's looking around and he finds that picture on the wall of Jedi, and it describes, battles that had taken place, and most of it's destroyed, but he gets this sense of like nostalgia and sense of loss at this fallen order that he feels attached to but doesn't know at all. And there's all this wreckage around, and he's climbing around all this rubble. And there was this statue that I know that you noticed, Mike. What did you take from the fallen statue that he found in the courtyard of that Jedi temple?
It's the part of the statue that was fallen I really enjoyed reading, because
what was that?
His hand. It was a severed hand, which, I mean, you can go back to Anakin, you can go forward to Empire Strikes Back, but it's definitely either going to be an echo or a foreshadow right there.
And it's neat because we get taken into this Jedi temple that is more of an ancient Jedi ruin, something that we didn't even get to see that much in the prequels, which were very much shiny and new. And the main Jedi temple was this big shiny tower in the middle of a planet that was entirely a city. So it was definitely a different atmosphere and something more maybe ritualistic, and sort of gave this more mythical vibe to the whole story. And that's where Luke kind of hunkered down for a couple days and taught himself how to wield a lightsaber. And he found some old remotes that he was able to reactivate with the help of R2-D2. And these are the little balls that shoot lasers at you, like we saw in A New Hope on the Millennium Falcon. So he was using these to sort of train and focus his mind and take on several enemies at once, and use the Force to deflect these little lasers, and just do the whole training bit on his own without any help, just from what he remembered from Ben's teachings and finding his way through the Force. That's sort of what happened there.
I like how even in the Star Wars universe there can be some training devices that are damaged by water. Like, computers still can't touch water in the Star Wars universe. Never mind R2-D2 falling in the swamp at Dagobah. There's some waterlogged training devices here. We can't use those. I'm sorry.
Also, you know what? There's this point in the story where they described R2 being hauled up to a cave by a rope, basically just kind of like by a rope and pulley. He's just kind of dragged up the mountain. I'm like, what the hell happened to R2-D2's boosters? He had like rocket packs that would come out of his legs and shoot him wherever the hell he wanted to go. What happened to those?
This is part of the decanonization of the prequels. That's my theory.
I don't know about that, because there was a point in the story that actually mentioned the prequels. Did you catch that?
Refresh my memory.
Here's an excerpt. I wrote this down because I thought it was hilarious.
I'm ready.
Switch heads, 3PO asked. What an unpleasant idea. R2-D2, some of the fantasies rattling around inside your dome border on the bizarre. I thought that was interesting and funny at the same time, because this line reminds us that R2-D2 knows a lot more to the story than he lets on, because his mind was never wiped, whereas C-3PO's was. So he's kind of like taking a jab at C-3PO because of that point in the prequels where C-3PO's head gets, replaced with that droid head in the factory. But C-3PO has no idea what the hell he's talking about.
When is C-3PO, when is he wiped?
His mind was wiped at the end of Revenge of the Sith, I believe.
Oh, wow. When
they were given to Senator Organa.
Wow, okay. I guess it's been a while since I've seen the prequels.
Yeah, R2-D2 got through it. Like, he was allowed to keep his memories because R2 is a very, very important character to he's a very important droid, so he was able to keep his memories, whereas C-3PO was not.
That is a great callback right there. Wow.
I thought that was fun, and it's one of the first like blatant references to the prequels.
Ah, so the decanonization conspiracy that is completely founded in my brain is gone.
Right.
One other thing that we get to see in this is kind of the idea of Empire sympathizers. I thought that was a kind of an interesting dynamic, because we're before the Empire has fallen. This is post. The Empire's definitely suffered a great blow,
but they're still very much alive.
Absolutely. And one of the characters that we meet, Farnay. She's a young girl, a Deveronian, which maybe we can post a picture of a Deveronian or something like that somewhere, just in case you don't know off the top.
I don't even know what they look like. I didn't look that up.
It's one of the aliens that you see in Mos Eisley Cantina grinning. It's Deva, devil. It's basically a devilish looking alien. But that's what a Deveronian is. So when they talk about the pointed teeth of some of the characters in this book, that's where I get that. So watch the Mos Eisley Cantina scene in A New Hope. And
definitely paints the picture.
You'll see a Deveronian in there. But Farnay is a young Deveronian, probably early teenage years, who takes a liking to Luke, or takes a little bit of curiosity to Luke, I guess. She's definitely skeptical of him at first. But Luke is trying to talk to her, and her perception of the Empire is that it keeps order throughout the galaxy. She definitely knows there's some sketchy stuff going on as far as like burning crops and the Empire kind of just being generally kind of nasty sometimes. Mm-hmm. But she feels like that there is a type of order that kind of dominates over everything, that keeps everything in place. Which Luke counters with like, that's stupid. Like they do awful things. Like they blow up Alderaan, which I imagine is like galaxy-wise news. If the Empire destroys an entire planet, I feel like
you'd think that would get around, and
that would definitely color somebody's idea of what this government is that you have. But no, Farnay, the Deveronian, she's definitely. She doesn't want the Empire to fall, at least until she meets Luke and kind of sees what he's all about.
Yeah. Do you think that's propaganda, or do you think that they actually like feel solace in or take solace in the way that the Empire is sort of managing their entire world?
I think that propaganda is definitely the majority of that, for sure. I mean, in the same way that any country could brainwash their own citizens, I do think that that's part of it. But at the same time, she's observing things around her too, and she knows that there's an order to her life. Maybe she's been told the rebellion wants to destabilize that, but there's part of it. Like she definitely acknowledges that the Empire is not great sometimes, but she also acknowledges some of the good they do in terms of like keeping the peace or whatever, or enforcing rules that she feels might kind of hurt her and her family in the end.
Yeah, that was definitely something that you get in a lot of the canon media. Like they're kind of expanding that story a little bit, where not necessarily all of the people that are involved in the Empire are bad. They don't even know that they're it's all a matter of perspective. Like there are people in the Empire that have been in the Empire their entire lives, and they think that their way is the right way, and they don't have the same motivations as the Emperor, who just wants complete power, but they see the rebellion as a threat to basically order, and they think that order is right, and maybe they're right in that. And from a certain perspective, like there's something good about that sort of stabilization. And when you meet characters like Farnay, like it tosses you back and forth on both sides of that fence. So let's go back to Sarko Plank just a little bit.
Yeah.
I think he's really kind of cool. And I like characters like this. Like you said, Cad Bane, he's one of my favorite characters from the Clone Wars series. He's so freaking cool. I hope they bring him back.
I didn't pay attention to the Clone Wars until they introduced that character.
He's so different and so just, he's unique and so cool. But, he's basically like, he's Clint Eastwood in space, basically. He's a badass.
He has a way to get out of most situations. He's very sure of himself. He goes head-to-head with Jedi without even thinking twice about it.
Yeah. And Sarko Plank is kind of like that. I can kind of see, whether maybe not the physical similarities, but he's kind of the same in a way. He's confident in his own abilities, and he sort of seems to hide things up his sleeve, and, quite literally, actually. And he goes up against Luke, no problem. He doesn't seem to have any fear that Luke might be able to best him, because he thinks he's just like this, young, know-nothing, nobody's Padawan. And then that was a line that came from this book where he says, "Nobody's Padawan, the last apprentice of an extinct religion. Care for a duel?" And I just thought that was so cool. Like, cause in one line, he just like, he put down Luke in the, he hit him where it hurts. Luke is feeling completely alone and completely lost, and like he's trying to find his way through the Force in his own right. And this guy just comes out of nowhere, and he's just like, "You're all by yourself. You know nothing." and we're about to fight. And, like, that's got to be so crushing.
To me, it's like Cad Bane in the future, you know? Like, this is Cad Bane kind of knowing that he, like, yeah, the Jedi fell after all, and I was right all this time. Like, this extinct religion, you know, whatever it is, you're all that's left, and now I get to reap the benefits of it. And give me your lightsaber, boy.
Yeah, absolutely. Luke is totally feeling it. Like, at this point, he's done some training, but he's also just gone through, like, this emotional breakdown where he just says, I can't do it. I don't understand how, and there's no one to teach me, and there never will be. I'm the last of the Jedi. The last of the Jedi sank to the grass in despair. When I read that, I was just like, damn. You know exactly how he's feeling at this point. Like, he is crushed. He's completely crushed, and this guy comes in, he just, like, puts him down on the ground. He's just like, you're a nobody. You have nobody there for you. He just reminds him that he has no family, he has no teacher, he just has a ton of responsibility to the rebellion and his fallen order. And it kind of seems like this might be it for Luke. Like, in his own mind, like, he knows he's in trouble. He's kind of getting the lightsaber under his control, but this guy's got an electro staff, and that's a lightsaber resistant weapon that he can, you know, definitely use to hurt Luke. And he does. Like, there's a point in this book where Luke almost dies before anything else can happen in the original trilogy. Like, Luke almost dies on this planet where nobody knows where he is. He's kind of fending for himself in this lost Jedi temple, and he has the threat of the Empire coming to get him, and this new guy who just wants to kill him and take his lightsaber and find a bunch of gold or something in the basements of this Jedi temple that he thinks exists.
And he rises up, you know, and he comes past that, you know, he has his awakening like Rey did in Force Awakens. He he grabs a hold, he harnesses the Force and just kind of uses it, and he feels it. And that's one of the coolest parts about this book that I thought was the description of what it's like to use the Force and what it's like to realize that you have the power over it. He's envisioning something like some Force clamping over a lever at some point and pulling it down. And I just think, like, it was a great moment to see that character you just described as being so sad and defeated, as just, you know, coming into his own again, just like Rey did, you know.
There was another part that I really liked and I highlighted, just an excerpt. Luke closed his eyes and let himself sink into the Force, allowing it to wash over him. He let his awareness drift, carried this way and that by the living presences around him, in the way they made the energy field ripple and dance. I thought that was, one, very poetic, very beautiful description of the Force. On the other hand, I'm thinking, like, this is like getting so stoned. Like, this is a high on, like, we'll never know. Like, no dosage of or strain of marijuana could ever make anybody feel this way. I don't condone drug use. I've never taken marijuana in my life. I just thought that this was a description of some sort of high that, like, we could never experience in our universe, only if we gave ourselves into this mysterious essence that is the Force. I thought that was really, really cool.
The electro staff you mentioned of Sarko Plank. Did your brain go to Finn on outside Maz Kanata's?
Traitor!
Yeah, that weapon gets its debut in this book.
Absolutely.
A weapon that can hold its ground against a lightsaber, you know?
Yeah.
That's it.
It's nothing too new. I mean, the electro staff is like one of many lightsaber resistant materials. Back when the first trailer came out, I made a whole post about all those materials just because, like, I was dissecting that new lightsaber. I'm trying to figure out what it could have been made out of at the bottom of the hilt, because I'm like, well, if a lightsaber touches that, it's going to be, you know, completely destroyed, and those braces are just going to get lobbed off. But turns out there's a bunch of things that can resist a lightsaber, and the electro staff is definitely one of them. General Grievous's Magna Guards used these in the prequels, so it's not the first time that we've seen them.
Right.
And like you mentioned, they were used by that trooper in The Force Awakens going up against Finn when he recognizes him on the battlefield at Maz Kanata's castle.
I think that's specifically thinking of this book as the journey to The Force Awakens. I think definitely meant to kind of plug in your brain saying, like, oh, hey, by the way, there are these things that can resist lightsabers, and they were issued.
For sure. Yeah, that's so cool. Like, I just love the idea that, like, anybody could go up against a Jedi, and especially in a universe like this where, we know the Jedi exist and that they used to be this very powerful race of beings, but a lot of the Jedi that we follow, like, they're novices. They have no idea what the hell they're doing. Like, Luke didn't know what he was doing. Rey doesn't know what she's doing, and they're going up against these opponents that have these weapons, luckily, that can go up against lightsabers that they never thought they'd have to run into because they thought all the Jedi were dead. So it's neat to see them come into their like kind of aggressive side, fighting these people with their electro stabs and stuff like that. And like you said, like, Luke, he rose up to the challenge. And, I don't think without this provocation by Sarko Plank, especially with the threats against Farnay, who's kind of off in the distance and being threatened with her life as well, like, Luke made it happen. He came back from adversity where he was blinded by Sarko Plank and really had no choice but to use the Force to guide him and to block all the blows that Sarko Plank was aiming his way. So I think the story framed Luke's coming up in a really interesting and, like, action-packed way. He wasn't just, like, in a field meditating and he's like, oh, I get it. Like, he had to experience it. He had to be put in harm's way and have the Force guide him in that way to come about into his powers, into the way that we see him sort of coming into that again in Empire, and then finally mastering most of that in Jedi. Speaking
of who Luke is and who he becomes in this, one of the big criticisms that I've heard, from friends and online as well, is that, like, Luke's character in Star Wars: A New Hope just kind of being kind of like a whiny teenager, which I definitely see here. You mentioned in your notes that there is a point where you kind of see Luke speaking in a way that you don't see consistent with that character.
Yeah, there's this quote where he's, like, talking to somebody and, as one of his aliases. I think this is when he was undercover and he was talking to one of the stormtroopers that was passing him before he even left on his original mission. He was explaining how to cook chuba stew, but he was talking in, like, the way that I imagined it. It was like this, southern drawl.
Yeah,
like, he uses like ain't and Chubas ain't just hot chow, It's an unfortunate misconception. See, what you need to do is season them. And, like, I'm like, Luke would never talk this way. I couldn't even imagine Luke talking in a southern accent, even if he was trying to fool stormtroopers. Like, it just didn't make any sense to me. It kind of took me out of the story, but...
I've heard an English accent in Star Wars, but never a southern accent,
I know, that would be something new. I mean, Cad Bane is probably the closest that we get.
Yeah, he's got that
He kind of
drawl.
has a little bit of a drawl, but it's, it's a little different. All right. So as far as, like, the serious stuff goes, like, any of the character development or anything, did you have anything else in this book that you thought really provided something cool to the story?
Just the little stuff, like things that you pointed out, Luke admitting that he can't swim.
Oh my gosh. I laughed so hard when I saw that because, like, you're taken back to the trash compactor and you're thinking, like, oh, he's flailing all around because he's got this thing wrapped around him and it's dragging him into the bottom. But, like, how much of that also was, like, he has no idea how to handle water because he grew up on a planet full of sand.
With where he had to have a moisture farm to have liquid, like that.
Yeah, just to gather air from evaporators.
There are no swimming pools on Tatooine.
That was funny to me. It's just one of those, like, little bits. You don't think about that, but when it's written, like, it's like, oh, that's so obvious and also hilarious. Like, this guy doesn't know how to swim. He's the hero of the galaxy, but he has no idea how to tread water. So funny. Oh my gosh. What? There's this other part where they just dropped off their ship at the guy who's going to fix it for them, and they go over to the hotel, and they get their room, and they go upstairs, and 3PO is, like, fussing over, like, the power connectors in the room, basically, like, the power outlets, and he's thinking, like, he and R2-D2 are going to be, like, electrocuted just by plugging in for a recharge. I thought that was so funny because, I mean, you and I have traveled quite a bit, you with your band and, me traveling around with bands and with my family or whatnot. Like, we stop in these dingy, crappy hotels and, like, you're just looking everywhere at everything and you're just like, okay, what disease am I going to catch? How am I going to die in this filth hole? And turns out droids think about the same things.
Yeah, I mean, there is a huge element of the story that relies on the input of, or just like the interjections of R2-D2 and C-3PO. And I have to wonder if that's a part of, the story. While C-3PO is not telling it in first person, this is being relayed to Blue 3 by C-3PO. So
right.
You have to wonder if like some of their dialogue is being kind of emphasized in this story because of that specific reason, and that, again, the charging is just, it's kind of a nice little reminding you where the story is coming from, in the middle of it all.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. I thought that was fun. Towards the end, after the battle happens between Sarko Plank and Luke, Sarko kind of falls down into this really long, really deep pit, and Luke kind of just throws his electro staff down there kind of dismissively, but he knows that Sarko is alive down there. C-3PO isn't quite sure, but Luke says he feels it, and of course we know that he survives because he's in The Force Awakens. But I was thinking about that, and like, I don't know how I feel about that ending for this book, with Sarko Plank, because it's like, okay, I know this is supposed to like make us interested in what happened and like how he got out of there and everything, but I don't know if I really need to know that. Like, I know that he's in The Force Awakens, so he makes it, and doesn't really seem like he does anything else that's important to the story at any point. So I don't know what that actually provides, other than sort of a callback to when Boba Fett falls into the Sarlacc pit. It's the same sort of thing. He falls into this pit and you think he's dead, but turns out he's probably actually alive. And where we know the story for sure was Sarko Plank, we don't know that yet for Boba Fett. So really all that part of the story did for me was sort of like make me think about that again, and when they're going to bring Boba Fett back into the story. So I don't know. That was just a little thought that crossed my mind.
I mean, speaking of the ending in general, we have a very sharp falling action there, dare I say none at all. It's kind of just, they move away, he still feels the presence of Sarko. But they're, then it just cuts right back to the framing, the epilogue, where we hear Blue 3, who's now kind of opened up to 3PO and is letting him use her real name.
Right, yeah.
And like she says what's on my mind, which is how did you get off of Deveron? Like, how did that happen? Which I imagine would be a great story of like, Luke running to the Y-Wing, the old Clone Wars Y-Wing that he's flying, and jumping in and evading. Like, another great way to close out the story with a bunch of Starfighter description. And,
That's the way you want the book to end.
I guess, but I mean...
That's your story.
But I mean, that's what 3PO says. He kind of like, I imagine him just looking at the camera and be like, that's a story for another time. And he says that, there's a whole lot left to this, there's a whole part of it. Like, Luke has a whole mission he has to get back to now, he has to go. Yeah. But maybe the point of that is that this mission that Luke was sent on in the first place what is he doing? Like, I forget.
Well, the mission was to another planet, but he didn't make it there. And instead of going back to base, he decided to stop off at this place where the Force was calling him.
Right. But I think maybe that's telling me right there why it wasn't important to finish this story, is because the task at hand that Luke had to accomplish here was just so mundane that or just something that he didn't want to go on, and the point of it was just to talk about this Jedi temple and him going to there. Right. But yeah, I mean, in general, I could have, personally speaking, I could have used a little bit more of a denouement, just kind of just a little bit more at the end of the story, hightailing it out of there. Some great action scene to end it, beyond... there's usually, a climactic starfighter battle in most of the movies, yeah.
I think that would have made it a lot more thematic, it would have made it more like a movie. If this book were a movie, I think it probably definitely would have ended that way. But as far as these young adult novels go, these three specifically, it's supposed to highlight very specific points in these characters' development. And for Han Solo in the other book, I'm not entirely sure what the theme of that book was. It was very much a fun adventure between him and Chewie, and it sort of broadened his story a little bit to show that he knows a lot of people. He's well connected, and that kind of played into The Force Awakens pretty well. And this one sort of played into The Force Awakens with the whole Jedi training thing and but this was very much an important part of Luke's character development, whereas I don't think maybe the bookends of this particular young adult novel really provided anything to that. the bit with Wedge was kind of cool at the beginning, and maybe they could have added something a little more at the end, but it's supposed to be short, and I think they got the gist of the book hammered away pretty well throughout the meat of the story that C-3PO was telling. So if you want more of that, like, a lot of the other books are a lot more thematic. Aftermath in specifically is set up very well for a movie.
Okay.
I think he wrote it in acts, and there are also cutaways that kind of introduce other characters and these little interstitials and stuff. And it's written more like a script than it is a book.
Okay.
So you might like something like that.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to digging into some of the young adult fiction that comes out of Star Wars at this point.
I think Aftermath might be a good next step for you.
Yeah.
Because you said you're looking for something post-Jedi, and that takes place post-Jedi.
Perfect. One more little bit of fun thing that I wanted to toss in there that kind of relates to a point we made last week. Man, they touch on the Luke and Leia romance again in this book.
Oh yeah, they do.
Oh my gosh.
That was weird.
I can't even believe they would throw that in. Like, it makes sense because of the timeline and where we are in the story, but just that, like, I feel like that's just taboo in Star Wars to reference that moment.
It's a moment where he's getting nostalgic for his friends and kind of like wondering what they're doing.
And he goes, Luke felt his breath catch when he thinks of, like, the beautiful leader that Princess Leia is.
Yeah.
And like what is that? That goes along with that weird, like, sexual excerpt that I read earlier, which is just like, this is out of place in a YA novel, and there's just like, why do I have to think about that? I mean, anybody reading this book that has seen any other Star Wars, any of the two movies, or really anything, and anybody's reading it from a later perspective is just going to be like, wait a second. Oh,
it was
man.
slightly uncomfortable.
Yeah. And I guess, like, got to roll with it, but, and like, it makes sense. It's realistically written. Luke would definitely be kind of thinking, but you think that some kind of weird, like, genetics thing would be stepping in at this point. Like, right? Like,
maybe. I don't know. It was one of those points in the book where, like, I think the author is, continually trying to remind the reader that this is happening, after episode 4 and before episode 5, because he doesn't know anything about his father yet, so he keeps he keeps referring to his father as like this heroic person in his mind, like this fallen Jedi who was taken out by evil, and like he keeps referring to his father when he's communicating through the Force, and he's saying, "I'm sorry, Father," like, I don't, kind of in the way that Kylo Ren speaks to Anakin, but his reverence is more towards a father figure he never knew, and that was still very much a benevolent guy, and like was taken out inconsiderately by this evil person that is Darth Vader. I think it's just one of those moments to kind of remind you of where we are in the story, even if it's a little weird. All right, so I think that's basically the meat of the book. I think we got through pretty much everything in that book that we thought was interesting. So circling back.
Yeah, it gets us back to the idea of the question we first asked, which is, in the context of Star Wars canon, is it worth it to read this book?
Yeah.
And
what do you think?
Okay, my answer to this question is yes. And to briefly elaborate, it's because this is such a short book. Mm-hmm. Someone who reads quickly will brush through this thing in an hour and a half, 2 hours tops, if that, and that makes it worth it to me to spend 2 hours of your life, whether you would be, hey, you could be rewatching Star Wars again, or you could just go try this new book and just get a new perspective on Luke and kind of see more about what he was like before Empire. Mm-hmm. I think so. For that reason, I think this book is worth it. The writing is not excruciating to read. It is quite good. For a young adult novel, and I'm excited to see what more Fry has to offer as far as his Star Wars offerings.
Absolutely. I think he's a great writer, and I think I followed along with this book a lot better than I have some of the others. We mentioned Aftermath a few times, and as much as I enjoyed the story of that book, I just really couldn't find myself focusing on the story as much as I was on the writing style of Chuck Wendig. His story is great, and like, I gotta give him credit where credit is due, but I really didn't like the way that book was written, whereas this one was very easy to read, very easy to follow along with, and it was fun. He put a bunch of stuff in there that was, it was funny, it was enjoyable, it was a good mixture of things that I think make a good Star Wars story. it fits in perfectly with the movies, and it definitely added a lot to at least Luke's character arc, which super beneficial. And also, to Rey's story as well. Like we mentioned before, like Luke and Rey's story sort of echoes, and whether or not they have any deeper connection than we know currently, like you can find a lot of Luke in Rey, and this story sort of expands the idea of how a Jedi is supposed to find his way through the Force without a teacher. And although Rey has Luke now, or hopefully will at the end of The Force Awakens, it sort of echoes her tale a little bit. So it provides a lot to the overall Star Wars story in a way that was sort of surprising to me. I didn't really expect to get a whole lot from this book, but sure enough, like a couple hours later, like I had an entirely new perspective on Empire Strikes Back and Jedi just based on the short story that happened at the Jedi Temple at Eden.
Nice.
Yeah.
I think that kind of brings us to the end of our episode at this point. I think we had a really good discussion on that, and it's kind of opened my eyes as to the possibilities of what it's going to be like to talk more about books and the idea of not reviewing them, but really kind of talking about what we have to gain from these things.
Absolutely.
Even if there are parts that we don't like, there's always something we can gain from reading these books.
I agree.
Whether it's the nice artwork or just getting a little insight.
I think in any book there's going to be a little something that adds to the story in a beneficial way. And maybe in the future we'll do some more of these episodes. I think we probably will. I'll let you choose the books and I'll just follow along with you. So I don't know what we'll read next. Do you have anything that stands out right now?
I mean, Aftermath on your recommendation is going to be what I go for next.
All right, perfect, because I've already read that.
Perfect. All right, well, I guess you're waiting on me.
I will have to reread it, though, so that I can put down some notes, because Kindle wiped all mine when I switched. But that's okay. So Aftermath, I guess, is the next book. That probably won't be for a couple of weeks. We'll probably have a couple episodes or something in between to give us some more time, because that one's a little bit longer of a read. But if you want to read that, that'd be great. Otherwise, thanks for listening to this episode. This has been episode 4. We'd love if you share your feedback with us on Twitter. You can find us there as Mike Comite and Curbside Audio, or at Bantha Fodder FM. We'll have links to all that in the show notes, and we've had some great talks with people on Twitter already. We've had some really awesome interactions with other Star Wars podcasters, and the community there is really great. So we really appreciate all the support, and we love listening to all the other shows like Tarkin's Top Shelf and Idiots Array, Podcast 2187. Like these are great shows that you should really follow along with. To get, different takes on the Star Wars story and some more of the kind of up-to-date news, which we don't really follow quite as much on this show. Just follow along with them, follow along with us, and, together we can all kind of make something really cool. The aforementioned show notes are at banthafodder.fm/episode/4. We'll have all the links to all the stuff that we talked about in this book, including links to where you can buy this book. If you listen to this entire thing and hadn't read it, we'll put some links in there for Aftermath and various, digital copies and physical copies as well, so you can get a hold of that. And if you get a second, hit us up on iTunes. Like I mentioned before, we had a couple of reviews, and that's awesome. Like, seriously, that's the greatest thing in the world. It gives us an idea of how you're liking the show. Even if you don't like the show, give us some notes on there. Hit us with a couple of stars. That way we know what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and we can keep the show growing. Because, I think you can agree with me, Mike. We want this thing to go for a while, and we can really only do that with people that are listening, that care, and actually, can give us some positive or constructive feedback.
We really want to inspire some cool conversations with this, and you kind of pointing us in the right direction will help us a lot. So please, feedback is important. Feedback is a gift.
Absolutely. So hit us up on iTunes. Until then, Mike, do you have anything else?
I do, actually. I want to thank my friend Joshua Cipolla, who is a composer, for letting us use his music, Baby Girl, which you heard at the beginning of the episode when I read my sensual excerpt from Weapon of a Jedi. You can find him at Joshua Cipolla, that's CIPOLLA.com. And definitely there's a vocal version of that track as well, too. So if you're looking to hear something more of that music, that sweet saxophone, please just look up his website and drop him a line. He's a great composer.
Yeah, thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Deanna, for having me on the Misaligned show the other day. And thank you again to all of you listening to the show. We couldn't do it without you. Say goodbye, Mike. Okay. So what's this book called?